Please join me in prayer. Gracious and loving God, help us this day to understand and celebrate your dream for the world, to be transformed in Jesus' love, and to use our gifts to make a difference for others. Amen. Can you remember a time when you were standing on the cusp of freedom? I can still remember the day. It's clear as a bell when I received my college diploma in the mail. Maybe you remember sometimes when you walk across the stage, they haven't quite got all your grades together yet, so they give you a blank book with nothing in it. But when I received that diploma in the mail, I remember this strange feeling of, now I can do anything, which was, of course, an overstatement, but it was a moment of transition. It was a moment of new possibilities for living, and it was a moment that allowed me to open my mind to different ways. I was on the cusp of freedom to go in a new direction. This whole story that we're talking about in these weeks as we walk through the book of Exodus together is about freedom. Rabbi Shai Held says that this story, this Exodus story, gives us the deepest glimpse into who God is and what God's about. For the Jewish people, if you want to know what is essentially God about, what is really God's dream for the world, it's contained in this story of Exodus. The deepest sense of who God is has to do with freedom and liberation. And that's why this moment, as we hear in the scriptures today, is to be remembered and celebrated forever by Jewish people in the feast of the Passover. Now, I can imagine times throughout the history of the Jewish people when they were deeply engaged with this story. Early on, when they were taken into captivity in Babylon and subjects of a foreign empire. Or later, when the Romans destroyed the temple in Jerusalem and the Jewish people were cast into a wide diaspora around the world. In Europe, through the centuries, as Jewish people were separated into ghettos and persecuted regularly just for being Jewish. Even more recently, in the last century, when Jewish people were hunted down and sent to concentration camps. In moments like these, you can imagine people sitting around the Passover table with that same longing for liberation from God that those people at that first Passover had in Egypt under the thumb of Pharaoh. But I can imagine other Passovers when things were peaceful and settled, times of prosperity. Perhaps those Passover meals became a lot like some of our celebrations, more concerned about who's going to sit where at the table and who's invited and what will we do on that night to make sure nobody gets into some sort of argument. Those typical kind of family gatherings. In their very normalcy, they dulled that sensibility, that longing, that sense of trust in God's liberating power. It's all too easy to settle into a kind of pseudo-freedom where we're free enough that we forget God's ultimate kind of liberation that will truly put us on the cusp of freedom. This is certainly true politically, I think, where we settle in and forget to participate in our own democracy, for instance, for the cause of freedom. It's true spiritually too, that we get stuck in letting many of the spiritual things that keep us captive. Old feelings of guilt and shame, old expectations of others, habits of needing to live into the kind of world that maybe our non-Christian neighbors, some non-Christian neighbors or non-faithful neighbors live into, of getting wrapped up in kind of success and material comfort. Those things hold us captive sometimes, don't they? It's that kind of captivity that Jesus was talking about in the gospel lesson today when he talks about forgiveness. That forgiveness sets us spiritually free from the captivity of guilt and shame and old stories that keep us where we were, and in that moment of forgiveness put us on the cusp of freedom. But Jesus points out that often we are more likely to want to stay in the old land of captivity and keep others in the old land of captivity rather than giving them the freedom, giving them the grace to stand on the cusp of freedoms. My friends, God's deepest desire, God's dream, is still liberation and freedom. And you and I, who call ourselves God's children, are still standing on the cusp of freedom. Whether it's politically or socially or spiritually. The question is, are we ready to move? Are we ready to leave the old behind for the sake of a new future that's not yet quite clear? God continues to move, but as the people in the Exodus story, are we standing with our loins girded and with staves in our hand? I understand that this is difficult. The very story of Moses and Egypt, this whole story is a story of how difficult it is. There are forces that push against freedom. In the Exodus story, Pharaoh is sent plague after plague after plague, warning after warning after warning, and the more these plagues come, the more resistant he becomes to the freedom and liberation of the Hebrew people. This kind of resistance, right? This kind of resistance to change or to see God's freeing power is both political and spiritual. Think for a minute of people in our history, of Robert E. Lee, where the Confederacy had to be absolutely crushed before they sued for peace, or Adolf Hitler in his bunker, holding out hope till the last minute that his obstinance will bring victory for the day. And it happens to us spiritually too, where when we try to accept the kind of forgiveness that God gives us, the shame and the guilt refuse to let us go. Or when we think we should forgive somebody, the old hurts and the old resentments come up and keep us from truly setting them free. And so we shouldn't be surprised in moments when it seems like we're standing on the cusp, but the resistance to freedom grows stiffer and stronger. I have to wonder if the moment that we're in now is not a Passover moment. As you and I are sheltered in place, in some ways we stand on the cusp of freedom. Many of us, many who I talk to these days, talk about how their lives have become simpler. Families have become closer. They've become less distracted as there's no sports to watch or any of those other things that used to distract us so easily from noticing that perhaps we were actually held captive. I've lived on the peninsula for 18 years and in the Bay Area all my life. And I know that we are held captive in this area to some sort of god of busyness, to a God who thinks we have to cram as much in as we can, that we have to have the best of everything, the best of education for our kids, the best experiences, the best. And I've seen how it drives many of us into a kind of captivity. And maybe this helps us stand on the cusp of freedom in a new way. That same sheltering in place has brought us to a new moment also in our understanding of our fellow citizens' captivity. Video after video, story after story of people who have been oppressed and abused, not just by the forces of the state, not just by law enforcement, but opening up our minds to the ways in which people of color have been ostracized and separated and put down and kept in their place. There's a new awareness among us in this time. So perhaps right now we are standing on the cusp of a new kind of freedom. The question is, for you and for me, the question is, are we ready to go? Are we in that kind of place where we're ready to stand up and gird our loins and take the staff in our hands to be ready to both receive and offer freedom? Are we ready in the face of forces that, even as we seem to get closer to freedom, are pushing back harder to refuse to yield? My friends, our God is a God of freedom. As the collect said today at the beginning of the service, our God is the God who always resists the proud. Our God is a God who never fails to hear the cries of the people in His mercy. So in this moment, when we can be standing on the cusp of freedom, are we ready to move? Because, my friends, freedom does wait for you and for me. God is at work bringing freedom to all people. Are we willing to stand on that cusp and be ready to move?